I'm excited to welcome you to the absolute best explanation of box sizing you'll find anywhere on YouTube. In this video, I use interactive animations to explain the theory, covering everything you need to know in detail, as well as a step-by-step walkthrough of its application in a real-world web application. So let's jump in. So to get an understanding of box sizing, we need to get an understanding of the total box dimensions. By default, the total width and height of a box will be the sum of the content width and height, padding, and border. So let's have a look at an example of what I mean here. Let's say we had an element that looked like this, and the CSS rules were defined like this. You can see this element has a width of 500 pixels, a height of 200 pixels, a padding of 50 pixels, and a 10 pixel border. I'm going to illustrate each of these on our element. In purple, we have the actual content. From our CSS rule, this has a width of 500 pixels, some padding either side of 50 pixels, and the border width is 10 pixels. So the total width of our element would equal 2 lots of 10 pixels from the border, 2 lots of 50 pixels from the padding, and then the content width itself, which is 500 pixels. If we were to add this all together, we would get a total width of 620 pixels. Now, if I were to do the exact same thing for the height, we would get a total height of 10 pixels plus 50 pixels plus 200 pixels plus 50 pixels plus 10 pixels, which would give us a total height of 320 pixels. I'm going to call the total width and total height calculated values. They're calculated because I had to sum up the width and height with the respective padding and border. It's not so obvious just looking at the CSS to see instantaneously what the width and height of the element will be. It involves a bit of calculation. Now, it's not the most complex maths, but you do need to add up some values. Let's have a look at this in VS Code. Alright, I've got an empty index.html file, and I've already hooked up a style sheet called app.css, which is currently empty. Inside the body, I'm just going to go and add an empty div. I'm going to give it a class called box1. Heading over to app.css, I'm going to select the class box1. I'll give it a width of 800 pixels, a height of 400 pixels. Let's give it a padding all the way around of 50 pixels and a border, which will make 10 pixels solid and black. Let's also give it a background color of plum so that we can easily see it in the browser. All right, let's check it out. So here are our boxes. I'm going to open up DevTools and I'm going to inspect the box. Scrolling down to the box model, you can see that the properties have been applied. 800 by 400, a 50 pixel padding all the way around, and a 10 pixel border all the way around. You can see that when I click the HTML here, it's showing the total dimensions, 920 by 520. Now the 920 is coming from the width of 800 plus 2 lots of 50 pixels for the padding left and right, which gets us to 900, plus 2 lots of 10 pixels for the border left and right, which gets us to 920 pixels. And the same thing for the height. The 520 pixels is coming from the height of 400 pixels, plus 2 times padding of 50 pixels, plus 2 times border of 10 pixels. So the takeaway point here is that by default, the dimensions of an element will be the sum of the width or height, plus padding, plus border. Now this behavior is actually defined in the CSS box sizing property. The box sizing property modifies how the total width and height of an element are calculated. It looks like this. Box-sizing is the property, and in this example, border-box is the value. The values we can have are content box or border box, where content box is the default value. And this is what we've seen so far, where the dimensions are calculated by adding the width and height, plus any padding, plus any border width. However, border box is the more commonly used value. So let's have a look at these in more detail. We'll start with content box, which is the default value, and is the behavior we've seen so far. If we set a width of 500 pixels, it means that the width of the content will be 500 pixels, and any padding and border is added on top of this. So the total dimensions is the sum of content, padding, and border. In this case, the set width and height will be smaller than the total width and height of the box. So what I mean by that is the width we're defining in our CSS property will always be smaller than the total width, because the total width will include the width as well as padding as well as border. I also want to highlight that the actual content dimensions are unchanged. The width of the content is always 500 pixels. So content box is the default behavior we've seen so far. Let's now talk about border box. For border box, if we set a width of 500 pixels, what this means, we'd actually end up getting something that looks like this, where now the total width is actually 500 pixels. That is, the content, padding, and border width all add up to 500 pixels. You can see when I add in these orange lines, the big difference between content box and border box. In content box, the width is just the width of the content. In border box, the width is the total width of the content, padding, and border. So in border box, the total dimensions include content, padding, and border. For border box, the set width and height will match the total width and height of the box. In border box, because the width includes content, padding, and border, it straight away is the total. So setting a width of 500 pixels in CSS will immediately give you the total width, which is very different to content box, which is being calculated, which is the sum of the content, padding, and border. Now, in order for border box to work, the content dimensions need to reduce. It's kind of like the content is getting squashed a bit because the width is now the total width, which needs to include the border width and the padding, which in a sense is kind of squashing the content so it all fits inside the set width. So now that we've compared content box and border box, let's look at the border box value in more detail. This is the setup we had at the start. Now I'm going to update the CSS to include the box sizing property with the value border box. Just as a reminder, the default value is content box, but I'm now changing this to border box. So by doing that, this is what will happen. The whole element will shrink. The set values of our width match the final box values. So the total width now is 500 pixels. So now we're going to work backwards. The total width is 500 pixels. The border is still 10 pixels, so we'll drag that up into our calculation. The padding is still 50 pixels, so we'll drag that up into our calculation. And for this to mathematically work, the width of the content has to be 380 pixels. So that when we sum this all up, we get a total width of 500 pixels. And I want to highlight that the content dimensions have reduced. Doing the same thing for the height, the calculation would look like this. Total height equals 10 pixels, plus 50 pixels, plus 80 pixels, plus 50 pixels, plus 10 pixels equals 200 pixels, where again, the content dimensions have reduced. So before, the total width and height were called calculated values. For the border box property, we can call them set values. Now when looking at the CSS properties, we have a width of 500 pixels, a height of 200 pixels. We can see straight away what the total width and height of our element will be. We don't need to do any calculations of the element in the browser. Let's play around with this in VS Code. In our index.html file, I'm just going to add another empty div, and I'm going to give it the class box2. In app.css, I'm just going to copy this rule. I'm going to paste it over here, and I'm going to update the selector to box2. I'm going to leave all the values, but just add in the box sizing property. And I'm going to set the value to border box. Now again, the default value is content box. So you could explicitly define it here, like that, but there really is no need. So I'm just going to remove it. All right, let's check this out in the browser. So as you may expect, our second box is now smaller than our first box. And that's because the width is actually the width we're defining over here. The total width of this box is 800 pixels. Whereas for box one above, the total width is the width of 800 pixels plus the padding either side plus the border either side. Let's check this out in DevTools. I'm going to select the second box, and you can see the little pop-up above the box in the browser is showing the total dimensions of 800 by 400 pixels. If I compare that to box 1, the total dimensions there are 920 by 520 pixels. Jumping back to box 2, let's go look at the box model. You can see the border is exactly the same as what we set, the padding is the same as what we set, but the width and height have both been reduced. So in a nutshell, by default, the total width and height will be the sum of the width and height values plus the padding plus the border. But when we set box sizing border box, the the total width and height of the elements are immediately set with width and height. The padding will be the same, the border will be the same, and to make this mathematically work, the actual content will reduce. So let's now discuss box sizing guidance. In almost every single project, you'll want to set the border box property on the universal selector. As a reminder, the universal selector sets the border box on all boxes. So in other words, every single element will have border box applied to it. And in fact, this is usually one of the first things to do in a new CSS document. Now, the reason we want to do this is because it's much easier setting values in CSS and knowing that those will be the total values in the browser. If we didn't change the box sizing to border box, setting values in the CSS, it would actually be a lot more complicated to know how the final dimensions of your elements will look in the browser. So let's wrap up the theory for this video by building a summary card for box sizing. We first looked at the value content box, which in CSS look like this, box sizing content box, and this is where the set width is the width of the content only, and content box is the default value. So let's say we applied a width of 500 pixels to our element. This would be the width of the content shown in purple. We could then apply padding and border, which would be added on top of this width of 500 pixels. So the total width and height of our element would now be more than 500 pixels, as it includes padding and border. The other value we looked at was border box. In CSS, it looks like this, box sizing border box. This is where the set width will be the sum of content, padding, and border. So having box sizing border box and a width of 500 pixels will look like this. Our content will shrink so that the content, padding, and border have a width of 500 pixels. And we can see the difference very clearly between the two by adding in these orange lines. Where for content box, we can see the width of 500 pixels is just the content, where for border box, it's the content, padding, and any border. Now that you've mastered the theory so far in this video, it's important to understand how we can use it in a real-world web application. For this part of the video, I recommend you download the starter HTML and CSS files in the description below and code along with me. We will be working on the homepage for a major full-stack web application called Quill, which you can learn more about in the description below. This project is part of my CSS full course, where we build the Quill homepage from scratch. You can join me for free in my CSS full course on YouTube by clicking in the video appearing in the top right now. So let's now apply the box sizing property on the Quill homepage. Essentially, every single element is going to have the border box property. All right, let's jump into VS Code and add in the box sizing property. So inside our app.css file, I'm going to come right to the top, and we actually already have a comment about adding in the universal selector here. So I'm going to remove this. I'm going to add the universal selector, grab our curly brackets. I'll grab the box sizing property and add the value border box. Let's check this out in the browser. Now immediately, the difference won't really seem that significant. But let me just show you a place where something significant has changed. This call to action section will now have the width we actually set. Earlier on in the project, we set the call to action card to have a width of 1000 pixels. So now the total width of this card will be 1000 pixels. Let's check this out in DevTools. I'm going to select this element. And you can see on the pop-up there, the width is 1000 pixels. Looking at the box model, you can see the padding is the padding we set in the CSS, 200 horizontally and 100 vertically. And you can see that the width is being reduced. It's 600 pixels. Now let's jump back to our universal selector, and I'm just going to comment it out to show you the impact it's had on the CTA section. I'll refresh, and now you can see the width of the CTA card is now a lot bigger. It's 1400 pixels wide. This is the default box sizing value of content box, where the width 1000 pixels is being summed up with two lots of 200 pixels for left and right, giving us a total width of 1400 pixels. So I hope you can see why we want to be using box sizing border box. It means that whatever values we're setting in our CSS will be the total values in the browser, making the size of elements much more predictable. If you enjoyed this style of teaching and are looking at mastering CSS, you can join me in my CSS full course, which is available for free on my channel. It's the world's most detailed CSS full course designed for complete beginners and covers everything you need to know to code CSS at a professional level. In the course, you'll experience the same high-quality teaching and build the Quill homepage from scratch. Join me today and also make sure to subscribe to my channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the CSS full course.